Hi, and welcome to the first of a series of conversations under the Thought Leadership Initiative, Africa Frontiers of Innovation. And this, of course, is courtesy of Canon EMEA. My name is Victoria Rubadiri. I am a broadcast journalist based here in Nairobi. So good afternoon. It's around 12 noon here in Nairobi to those of you who are joining us in this time zone. Good morning to anyone else who's joining us from around the world, and good evening. It is a pleasure to have you join this very important discussion. Listen, if you're joining us from the Canon EMEA LinkedIn page or Facebook, please leave your comments and questions. We want to make this session as interactive as possible as we move along. It's about you. You're joining the conversation. I like to call you my extended panel, as much as we have two very distinguished panelists that will be joining me for this afternoon discussion. So we're talking about education today. Extremely important sector and critical sector when it comes to the continent. We know it was disrupted the world over. Schools were shut down. Learners had to stay home because of social distancing protocols. And as a result, it frustrated their learning process. At least for here in Kenya, we had a 9-month shutdown. Schools just recently opened this month. And of course, there were many challenges when it came to ensuring the learners were safe as they headed back to the classroom. But let's take a look back and see how various countries across the continent responded. And please keep in mind that there were a lot of challenges when you look at access to internet, when you look at devices. Many learners simply did not have that to ensure that learning continued. And to join me in this discussion and to help unpack this as we move along and just the importance of digitalization and what that means for the future of education on the continent, I'll introduce our first panelist, Dr. Joseph Wambua, and he heads the Kenya Education Cloud. It's a platform where education stakeholders can find educational solutions. He has worked at the Kenya Institute of Curriculum Development for well over 10 years as a Chief Curriculum Development Officer, specifically in the area of e-learning. So he's the right guy to talk to during this discussion. We also have Juliana Lindsay, and she serves as UNICEF's country representative to Rwanda. She has worked with UNICEF since 1998, serving in various positions in Sudan, South Africa, Botswana, Ghana, and Kenya as well. Thank you both for joining me. I guess we can begin with how COVID-19, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Joseph. Let's begin with how COVID-19 really highlighted the need for new methods of education. The kids were home, and whether we liked it or not, whether we were ready or not, we had to have certain modalities ready to ensure that learning continued. And Joseph, let me begin with you. From the Kenyan perspective and really from the regional perspective, in terms of response, what were some successes that you can credit to how the Kenyan government responded, how other governments in the region responded when it came to ensuring, yeah, kids are home, but learning continues?
Thank you, Victoria. And thank you for having me here in this show, in this discussion. I would like to say, first of all, that many governments were not prepared for this. It was an emergency across the globe. And in Kenya, we cannot say that we were all that prepared, because being an emergency, people don't prepare for emergencies. But in Kenya, we were lucky that in KICD, we were already preparing radio lessons for our learners. This began long ago, early 70s. We were doing radio broadcast through KBC. KBC standing for Kenya Broadcasting Corporation. And we were also producing radio TV programs. These TV programs are produced and aired from KICD through a channel we call Edu Channel. And this channel became very prominent during the COVID time because learning continued. And as you say, our learners could not stay home without learning, because in education, there's what we call learning loss or learning losses. And this, if we are not careful, our learners would have gone through these learning losses, and they would be like retrogressing in terms of education. And so using the TV and the radio programs that I had from KICD, we were able to plug in very well and continue learning from home for our learners. Thank you, Victoria.
Thanks, Joseph. And before I bring Juliana in, just to follow up to that, because yeah, as much as we had the state broadcaster, we had radio covering those bases, especially in the very remote areas of Kenya. Were you sure that children were actually learning? I know it was a completely different approach because you don't have that person-to-person interaction where they can be monitored and you are actually ensured they understand what's being taught. This was a one-way kind of approach when it came to learning. From what you assessed, did children actually go through effective learning during that period?
Okay, thank you, Victoria. We conducted a survey online because we all know the challenges that we are going through as a people. And the only thing we were able to do is to conduct an online survey and see whether our learners were learning. And interestingly, most of our learners were learning. But again, I would like to be very sincere with you and say that we still have some areas where learners were not able to access these programs. Some were saying they don't even have a radio. Others were saying they don't have a TV. Others, they don't have a smartphone. So to be very frank, we still have a small percentage which was not able to access these programs. Thank you, Victoria.
Thank you. And certainly pointing out an area that we will unpack later. I mean, when you're thinking about basic devices like a radio and television, many learners did not have access to. And so, where does technology then come in to fill the gap? Juliana, let me bring you in on that, just to get your thoughts from Rwanda, how they responded. I know Rwanda has been touted for its very quick response to the pandemic. I know several classes were also built before schools were reopened, but from your perspective, also working with UNICEF, you also have a bird's eye view, if you will, on what's been going on across the region. How was response from where you sit?
Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be here as well. In Rwanda, like in Kenya, the government was able to relatively quickly put lessons on radio. About 98% of Rwandans have a radio, so that was the immediate focus. They were also able to put lessons on television, and that included sign language interpretation, because it's very important to reach children who don't learn in the same way, who don't have the same abilities as other children. The government also was able to put the curriculum online, so it is accessible online to any child who has a device and data. Now, of course, that's the big caveat, we realize, but it's good that it's there. It's an excellent starting point. We did realize that not only do many children not have access to devices, but also sometimes even if there are devices, the teachers or the students or the parents may not have the full awareness of how to access a web page, for example. So we learned through this that it's quite important to work on digital literacy for parents and on teachers and for teachers, and of course for students as they grow up, because they're the future parents. And this was similar in many countries around the region as well. Putting classes on radio, on television, where possible, getting it on the internet. It doesn't reach every child, but in Rwanda, we did some surveys, we collectively, government, UNICEF, NGOs, others, and it seems that about 80% of the children were able to access some form of learning online. So I'll stop there.
Fantastic. Thanks, Juliana. And even in terms of challenges, what did you notice probably offered barriers or were barriers in ensuring that learners were getting the learning that they needed during that?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, certainly the ability to use the technology or the services that are provided, especially disabled children. So I mentioned the sign language. We also, with other NGOs, were able to put some of the lessons into Braille, so that blind children, they could distribute the papers, the printed Braille papers to the children, so they at least could try to continue learning. We also worked with an NGO so that their volunteers could actually phone parents of disabled children on a regular basis to make sure that they could have some encouragement and a few extra tips on providing the support to those children that's needed. And of course, the obvious is access to devices for any child. There were a number of organizations that distributed radios to families that didn't have radios at home, because that's really the first starting point in terms of helping children get access to education when they're not in school.
Fantastic, and great to see that a group that's often ignored, and special needs kids, was actually catered to during that period. Let's move on to a larger perspective on just how education has changed or shifted on the continent, and whether it's changing fast enough. You know, oftentimes they'll say the education system in Africa uses outdated methods, is not preparing children for the future. But it's interesting because during this COVID-19 period, it offers or has offered opportunities in which educators, governments can tap into technology to ensure that they're up to par when it comes to the standards of education. I mean, we've seen the continent do this before in terms of leapfrogging into mobile phones, completely bypassing fixed line technology, right? And seeing that kind of shift and change, can the same happen in education? And really, would you say, has COVID-19 helped in accelerating that? I'll begin with you, Juliana.
Sure, thank you. So the changes on the continent over the past couple of decades are dramatic, particularly in terms of attendance at school. Our goal with governments used to be to try to get primary school children just to go to school. And now in many countries, Rwanda included, and I suspect Kenya as well, the enrollment and the attendance rates in primary school are well above 80 or 90% in most cases. So that big milestone in many cases has been crossed. The major challenge now is quality, is making sure that children, when they finish grade 4 or grade 5 or grade 6, that they can actually read and write and do basic arithmetic. We've seen progress in terms of the curricula. Joseph will know better than I that many countries have now put in place what we call competency-based curricula, which is more focused on actually understanding the material and having the reading or writing competency and not just throwing information at children. And there's no doubt that digital methods can help with this. They're not a substitute for a child being in the classroom with the teacher, but they're absolutely an effective aid that can be useful.
Certainly, certainly. And I know Joseph wanted to add on to the previous question. Go ahead, Joseph.
Thank you, Victoria. I wanted to add on what I submitted in that area that you had asked me earlier. And what I want to point out is that as Rwanda was doing sign language, in Kenya, we were also doing sign language interpretation. When you view EduChannel videos which were aired during COVID time, you will see a sign interpreter at the corner trying to interpret for learners who maybe are not able to hear what is being aired through our television programs. And also, I would like to point out that we also aired online programs which were aired through Kenya Education Cloud. And through Kenya Education Cloud, we were able to partner even with other organizations just to ensure our learners are able to get bundles which they could use to stream the online content. Thank you. Can I get to the other part of the question?
Certainly, because we're already on the competence-based curriculum here in Kenya. If you can just talk more on that in terms of that transition to a different education system.
Sure. Thank you, Victoria. So in Kenya, we are doing the competency-based curriculum. And I would like to say that it has picked on very well. Actually, now we are at grade 4. And in July, we are transiting our learners to grade 5. And the competency-based curriculum is a super curricula when compared to the objectives-based curriculum. Because in competency-based curriculum, we are looking at what is this learner able to do, as opposed to getting answers out of what learners are being taught. And this is very interesting for us as Kenyans, because we are pushing the curriculum a notch higher. And our learners are able to perform tasks. They are not just remote learners or other rote learners, but they are able to get ideas, get knowledge, and put it into action and actualize a skill which they are given to perform. So that is one way I can say competence-based curriculum is helping our country. And secondly, I would say that COVID-19 tried to accelerate the process of digitization of education, in that our teachers now, some of them are able to conduct online meetings, some are able to set up online meetings, and we are now comfortable with it. Earlier on, there was technophobia. Our teachers were fearing technology, leave alone conducting an online meeting. Even owning laptop and operating the laptop was an issue. But nowadays, our teachers are very competent to the point of conducting and setting up an online meeting. Thank you, Victoria.
Interesting point you bring out there, that teachers feared technology, right? They're the ones who are supposed to kind of usher learners into this new space. But they too needed some orientation, if you will. Juliana, let me come to you. In terms of that and ensuring that teachers are ready, teachers are prepared, great, we have the devices, wonderful, we have the curriculum. But for the people who are tasked with reaching students on this new and unique platform for many of them, how did preparations kind of happen, and how are they being engaged?
Good question. So there are two things. Rwanda has put out a program called Smart Classrooms, which has involved setting up digital technology in many of the classrooms around the country. And of course, you don't just throw in the hardware without showing people the software as well. So part of that process has been training teachers on how to use the Smart Classroom. In addition, the government realized, the Ministry of Education realized during the COVID lockdown and this issue with schools, that teachers themselves needed some additional training on digital literacy, as Joseph was alluding to. And so there was a expanded and improved and increased process over the last few months of training teachers on how to use laptops, how to access web pages, how to engage with students, et cetera, so that they could maximize the use of technology.
Fantastic. Joseph, let me bring you in. When it comes to, and I know this is quite a headache for a lot of educators, assessment. Now, granted, here in Kenya, schools have opened, but for many other countries across the continent that have not, testing is part of the education and learning process. And to ensure that it's a fair process, that students are being assessed well, how do you ensure that when you're dealing with distance learning? I mean, you can just imagine someone is in their room with a laptop. How can you ensure that they're not going onto Google to look up some answers, if you will, during an assessment process? How do you ensure that it's a very fair, process?
Thank you, Victoria. And it's a good question. Actually, what is not assessed is not well learned. If we don't assess what we teach our learners, then we'll be leaving them at a hanging point. They will be hanging. Because if we don't assess, we don't value the process of learning. And so I would say that in CBC, we are emphasizing on formative assessment as opposed to summative assessment. What we used to have earlier was summative assessment, in the sense that after the 4 years of education, our learners could get just one test to see what they have been able to acquire across the 4 years period or across the 8 years period for the case of the primary level education. But now we are emphasizing very much on formative assessment, and the formative assessment can come in different ways. We are saying this is assessment which goes on during the learning process. As the teacher teaches the learners, they continuously continue assessing the learners and see how far, how much, what gaps are there during the learning process. So we can start right there from the classroom. Our teachers can competently conduct formative assessment, but now we are on the online learning. So I am going to jump into the online learning and say that first, we have to inculcate the value of integrity in our learners. And CBC is very strong on values. We are coming strongly because we realize that our learners don't have values that are required, and one which can be used to ensure that our learners are assessed genuinely is the value of integrity. We just instill to them the importance of being honest, and when they are taking an examination, for example, they be careful just to give what they know. And in CBC, we are also saying that it is not about competition. Our learners are not competing. And so we are not trying to see who is better than the other, but we are trying to come up with a set of skills and packaging them and saying that this learner is able to do 1, 2, 3. This one is able to do 1, 2, 3. And that one does not mean that if you are not able to do what this other one is able to do, you are a failure. In CBC, we don't have failures. All learners are supposed to come out as successful. And therefore, that's why we are saying that we are advising learners to take a path which they can be able to pursue in life comfortably without them facing a lot of challenges. So Victoria, my point is integrity, honesty, and we can also structure assessment in such a way that we can do a project which they can carry out over a given period of time. Like for instance, they can be given a project to develop a kitchen garden in their homes or where they stay. And remember, even in towns, we can have a kitchen garden where we can have the hanging sacks, which are filled with soil, and they plant their sukuma wiki, they plant their spinach there, their onions, and they're able to harvest from there. So once they establish this kitchen garden, they can take some pictures and then send to their teacher, who will now add to their portfolio and be able to say, this lab was able to establish a kitchen garden, and these are the products. Thank you, Victoria. That is what I can say for now.
And just to follow up on that, Joseph, should integrity and honesty not prevail, are there other mechanisms, other modalities that can be used, for instance, artificial intelligence to help with feedback and monitoring? I know South Africa was pretty successful in putting together an artificial intelligence education platform called Miss Zora that actually helps with that. But from the Kenyan perspective, is that treatment possible?
Yes, I would say yes, Victoria. One thing I believe is that all things are possible. It's only that for us to be able to achieve some things, we may take a little longer and we may put in a little more effort, but all things are possible. What we are doing in Kenya Education Cloud, we are setting up an intelligent curriculum dashboard, which will be able to track all this for our learners. And whenever they take a course or they take some tests online, we'll be putting a portfolio for them, even without their knowledge and without telling them that this is what you are using to tell whether you are competent in doing 1, 2, 3 or not. So that intelligent curriculum dashboard is something we have in play. We are planning to have in KEC. KEC here standing for Kenya Education Cloud. So that is possible, Victoria.
Juliana, let me bring you in. After going through this crisis period, and you know what, it's still with us. We can't say we're out of the woods just yet. It's caused us to reimagine, relook at what a classroom can be. And of course, coming with it is a lot of challenges when it comes to budget and various implementation exercises. But from where you sit and what UNICEF is doing, I know it has an amazing program called Reimagine Education. Tell us more on what that seeks to do to kind of gear us in the direction of a classroom of the future.
Thank you, Victoria. Indeed, this is an initiative that began even before COVID, because we realized that globally we need to reimagine education in order for kids to have the skills they need, and also in order to reach all children, not just in primary school, but particularly those in secondary school, because so many teenagers, including in Rwanda, don't have the chance to go to high school. There are 5 main components of the Reimagine Education Initiative. The first one is making sure that we have good, solid digital content, because there's no point having a device if you don't have good teaching and learning information that works on that device. So the first one is the teaching and learning content. The second is connectivity. There's a major initiative called GIGA, which is run by UNICEF and the ITU, the International Telecommunications Union, together, to connect every school in the world to the internet over the next few years. As you can see, it's rather ambitious, but we've realized that this is critical in order for kids to have an equal opportunity then to access markets, to access different economic opportunities later on. The third component is making sure that devices are affordable, because the child at home also needs to be able to have some way to connect to the internet, which comes to the fourth component, which is connectivity at home in general for the population. So we're working with internet providers to see if there are ways to reduce those costs. And finally, the fifth component is engagement of young people themselves. They need to have the chance to be involved in deciding what the content should be, to give their input on what's an affordable amount of money to pay for internet connectivity, to give their input on what kinds of devices work best, what's most user-friendly, et cetera. So this is a major initiative that works with governments, works with the private sector, and it's being rolled out globally by UNICEF.
Wow, that is quite a grand plan. I think I just stopped at the fact that you said that GIGA part of the program wants to connect every young person to the internet by 2030. That is quite ambitious. And you know, that can't be done without, for lack of a better term, aggressive collaboration, which brings me to my next question for you, Joseph. How important is collaboration with private sector players, with NGO players, when it comes to ensuring you are delivering quality to the learners? I know in Kenya, we had to do a lot of that with the government collaborating with telcos to ensure they were able to deliver education while kids were at home.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Victoria. That is a very good question, because in Africa, we believe in Ubuntu. We also believe in working together, because we have a saying that says that if you want to walk fast, walk alone. If you want to go far, go with others. So we cannot achieve much as a Kenyan government alone, but we have to partner with our private sector and also with other partners from donors and foundations. And we partnered with Safaricom as KICD just to ensure that our last free bundles for them to be able to access online from Kenya Education Cloud. So I was saying that in Kenya, we have partnered with Safaricom, which is a telecom company. And Safaricom was giving our learners bundles. You just key in a USSD code, *544#, and you are able to select education bundle, then educational bundle from KICD, and then our learners were able to enjoy learning even during COVID using the free bundles. Yeah, that is one. Then two, we are also getting assistance from World Bank. We have a program we are calling the GPE, Global Partnership in Education. And this partnership is whereby we are getting a lot of resources just to make sure that we produce quality programs for our learners. And to start with, we are adapting content, interactive digital content for our learners in grade 1 and grade 2. Currently, we have already screened that content. We are now digitizing it just to make sure that our learners with special needs can be able to access that from wherever they are. And to start with, we began with learners with visual impairment and learners with hearing impairment. Those are the two categories we have already adapted, and we are now in the process of producing the content. And after grade 1 content, we are going to grade 2, and also make sure that the content is well adapted for learners with special needs. Because if you can recall, in our constitution, Kenyan Constitution 2010, Article 54 is very clear on learner special needs, and it stipulates that every learner with special needs should be given materials which are matching the ones which are given to learners who are regular or learners who don't have any issue.
All right, fantastic. I hope I am audible. We got lost in translation at a point. Thank you for filling in, Joseph. I think you need to come over to my part of the profession. That was really good. Apologies once again to those of you who were following the discussion. Let's head back to where we left off, and that was the importance of collaboration and cooperation. Joseph, you know this all too well when it comes to government, private sector, coming together to ensure that there's no interruptions or disruptions, much like what we experienced a few minutes ago. But how did that work, at least in the Kenyan context, where government collaborated with telcos to ensure that learning continued?
Victoria, come up again. I lost you for a moment.
Let me repeat that. Sorry about that, Joseph. So just the importance of collaboration and just for you to speak more on the cooperation between government and telcos when it came to ensuring learning continued.
Okay. In Kenya, I had pointed out that we got into a partnership with Safaricom, which is a Kenyan telecommunication company. And they were giving free bundles to our learners for them to be able to access online content from Kenya Education Cloud. And they were just required to dial *544#. Then you call Safaricom. Then you were able to get a step-by-step guide trying to ensure that you get your free bundle, which was 100 megabytes. And with 100 MBs, our learners were able to consume content without any problems from Kenya Education Cloud. Thank you, Victoria.
And let's talk really quickly about the importance of budget. We know that education takes a big chunk of the national budget, at least here for Kenya. But oftentimes you'll find efficiency and use of that budget can be a problem. A lot of the education budget was eroded last year due to COVID, as was many other budgets. But when you look at moving forward and what the budgeting process needs to look like to ensure we're implementing a lot of what we've been talking about throughout this discussion, bringing on new technologies, devices, making data more affordable, what does the government need to do? And even beyond the corporations you were just talking about with telcos, to ensure that it's using budgets efficiently? And that's for you, Joseph.
Thank you, Victoria. I think we need to re-strategize as governments because we have learned a lot from COVID. Personally, I don't want to look at COVID as a menace. I just want to look at it as a learning process or a learning opportunity because I learned a lot during COVID time. And one thing I learned is proper planning is key in every sector, not only in education, but in every other sector. Look at our health sector, look at our power, any other sector depends entirely on proper planning. And in Kenya, we had to put some measures in place just to ensure that we have some stopgap measures which are able to ensure that learning continues, as we had earlier said. And one of the things that our government did was virement, or viring of monies from one voted to another voted. And most of the monies were directed to production of these programs, just to ensure that they are running and our learners are able to access learning to avoid what we call the learning loss. And again, you're asking, going forward, how should planning be? And I would like to say that going forward, we should ensure that we have enough monies for emergencies, which can cater for large emergencies like COVID-19. And besides that, we need to plan with blended learning in mind, because I don't see ourselves going back to the normal way we were doing things before in 2019. And blended learning will be like a way forward to most of the governments across the globe, because we cannot manage to have our learners social distanced adequately. We cannot have our learners stay at home again, but we would rather plan having blended learning in mind going forward. Thank you.
Thanks for that submission. And indeed, like you've said, it's inevitable. Technology just will be a part of how we teach the next generation. I can see some questions are coming in from social media, and I'll take one at this point from Dennis. Dennis saying, do you think distance education provides equal opportunity? And he says, I think the opposite. He doesn't say why, but let me put it to the panel. Juliana, let me come to you first, and then Joseph will get your response.
Sure. So it's a really good question, and one that we grapple with, because our aim overall, together with governments, is to make sure that every child has an equal opportunity for education. I think the answer depends on what the situation of the child is. So if we're talking about a deaf child, for example, who might not have the chance to go to a school where sign language can be used, but the child has access to a television where sign language is used, that's a bonus for the child. On the other hand, if we're talking about a child in a poor family in a far village who can't afford internet, and if there are things that are required for the education that are offered on internet, and only the wealthy kids or only the kids who are lucky to have a device can access it, then that's obviously a disadvantage. So there's no across the board right or wrong, good or bad. The challenge is to make sure that we can get the best out of technology for every child in their particular situation. I hope that helps.
Absolutely. And Joseph, from you, I was reading an article that was talking about even with the interventions for online learning, for instance, in South Africa, they have 12 million learners. Only 500,000 were reached by that digital intervention, right? So you're just thinking about a huge chunk of learners that were left out because of the challenges Juliana just mentioned. So, what more can be done to close that digital divide, if you will?
Thank you, Victoria. I would like to start by saying that COVID-19 brought changes in our education sector. And across the globe, changes are always opposed. If you go back to your history, whenever a change comes by, people start by tending to oppose it. But what I would like to say is that when you become persistent and you say, this is the way we are going, as a government, we are going blended learning. People will now start gathering resources together and trying to ensure that they have all what it takes for them to be able to go through learning using the given opportunities. One of it being using technology. I don't think we have learners who say we are not going to school because we are paying school fees. School fees in some schools can go to the extent of 30,000, 40,000 in Kenya, and that is translating to $400 US. Yeah, and they manage to raise this money. And if you can look at our situation of education right now, most of the day schools education is free. They are not paying monies for their education. They are only paying something small to cater for maybe their lunches and maybe their teas at 11. And therefore, if we now use the monies which they were paying before and say that they are going to procure the necessary technologies which are required, I think we'll be there and we will be able to conduct blended learning the way it should be. When you come to radio programs, how much money do I need to buy a basic phone? By basic phone is like what we call in Kenya, the kabambe, mulika mwizi, just the simplest phone. And imagine that phone, Victoria, as a camera, and it also has a radio. They can catch KICD radio programs using that kabambe, and kabambe, if I was to translate, cost about $100. Not 100 by $1 $10 actually, because it is about 1,000. You can get a kabambe, and you can be able to catch the KICD radio programs. So I don't think this is supposed to be an hindrance to blended learning, and especially when we are talking about catching the radio programs, which are broadcasted through Kenya Broadcasting Corporation. So I think, Victoria, that is one thing I want to make very clear. And I also want to talk slightly to add something concerning the rights of our learners. And they say that in Kenya as well, all our learners have a right to education. And having a right to education, therefore, the parents should also play their role and ensure that they equip these learners with what they require for them to be able to learn. So going back to the question, is distance learning providing equal opportunities? I would say yes. For those people who are proactive, they can be able to get these programs just like any other Kenyan across any part of the country. And therefore, it all depends on our initiatives as parents and as education stakeholders. And my advice would be, when you see changes coming, please dive with them, jump with them, swim the tide. Don't oppose, just swim the tide, and all will be well. Thank you, Victoria.
Thanks for that, Joseph. And a great point there in terms of using what you have and scaling what works. You know, Juliana, I was reading a UNESCO report that talked about the importance of designing with deliberate consideration of the environment in which that innovation will reside. Africa is very unique, very diverse. And as much as we're talking about moving into a technological pathway when it comes to education, how important is it to cater to, also tailor a lot of the innovation and solutions to the communities that will be served by it when it comes to education?
It's absolutely critical, of course. I mean, one of the starting points is language. We advocate that the first years of school be in the native tongue. And in countries where that takes place, you know, if you just pull something off the shelf that was created in another language, it's not going to work in that particular environment. So the first step, of course, is making sure that digital content is accessible in a language that children and that teachers can understand. It's also important to make sure that it has culturally appropriate references. There's no point referring to apples in a country where apples are not part of the normal fruit that a child sees. So there are all sorts of different things that need to be done to make sure that the content is appropriate. And that's why one can certainly take concepts and ideas from off-the-shelf content, but it can also be created indigenously. It creates jobs locally to create that content locally, and it helps make sure then that the content will resonate with children and with families, which is, just one more thing on this point, which is why that fifth point on youth engagement in the Reimagine Education initiative is so important, that it not just be us adults creating things for children and young people, but that they have the chance to give their ideas about what works for them, that we test things out before they're implemented so that they can adapt and edit and guide the concepts and the content. Thank you.
Absolutely. Joseph, let me bring you in there. When it comes to what the future of education looks like now, you talked about blended learning being something we can't come away from on the continent. Governments having to prioritize budgeting towards that. But you know, when it comes to practically implementing strategies like that and ensuring that, yes, communities are receptive. You mentioned at times people can fight change. They don't see where this would help. Changing mindsets and ideas and thoughts towards something new and different. I believe, Africa is ripe for new ideas and technologies. We've seen, as I mentioned much earlier, we've managed to leapfrog different technologies into something much more advanced. And so even in terms of adaptability, we can do it. But from a practical sense, you're an educator. How do we ensure that it's received and it's utilized in a beneficial manner to all that will be using the technology?
Thank you, Victoria, for that question. It's a very good one. And I would like to point out that one thing that governments need to do is a creation of awareness. It's very important. And as you create awareness, you also show the public the need to embrace the technologies that we are proposing. And in this case, we are proposing blended learning because I'm looking at it and I am convinced totally that it is the way to go in education. And therefore, the only way we can do as a people is to embrace it. And this can start with the government trying to come up with some creation of awareness programs, which can start from the teachers themselves. Then we move to the learners, we move to parents, we move to education officers, and then the entire country. We can even buy airtime through the mainstream media and make sure that we drumbeat for the blended learning, because it is the way to go, and it is solving a lot of solutions for us. Because like now, if I was asked, it would be very difficult for me to be in this interview. But through technology, I'm able to meet with Juliana, I'm able to meet with you, Victoria, I'm able to meet with Regina, wherever she is, and we are brought together by technology. And I see a lot of potential in technology, and I think we have to first create awareness. We set apart a budget that is meant to make people aware of these technologies, and also show them the benefit of using technology in the learning process. The benefits are enormous. I think that is a talk for another day. if we engage now and start talking about benefits of using technology in education, I can talk the whole day about it. So allow me not to go there. So the other thing is that under the future of education, I think in KEC, we have something we are trying to come up with, which we are calling the Creator Studio. And in Creator Studio, we want to equip our publishers with the tools that are required to develop interactive digital content. We want to give them programs, programming languages, licenses which are free. When they get there, they download for free. They want to give them suits which are meant for developing content. When they get there, they just access the tools for free. They develop content and they submit. Because already in Kenya Education Cloud, we have a portal where publishers can be able to submit content for free. Then after they submit, they pay something for us to be able to evaluate. So I want to say that if we give them that platform, we will be kind of motivating them to produce a lot of content for our learners to get quality education. So that is another future of education I'm seeing, and it is being fronted through Kenya Education Cloud. And as I alluded to earlier, there's also the issue of development of an intelligent curriculum dashboard. In CBC, we are saying that all learners have a potential, and we have a duty to nurture their potentials. And therefore, for me to be able to nurture your potential, I have to realize it first. And if I'm using the intelligent curriculum dashboard, I'll be able to identify where my learners are strong and where they are weak. If there are interventions which I can bring on board to fix those weaknesses, then why not bring them on board and I fix the weaknesses? Then, but the ultimate goal will be to identify where my learners are strong in and therefore advise them accordingly on which career they can take in life. And I think that is another thing that we are coming up with, which is going to be a future of KEC and in general, a future of Kenya, because we are talking about CBC and we are talking about nurturing every learner's potential. Concerning development of content, we are saying that we are not going to develop content for only regular learners. And when I'm talking about regular learners here, I am talking about learners who don't have any impairment. But we are saying that we are going to produce content which can be consumed by all learners. A term that I want to bring in now, one size fits one. Not one size fits all, but one size fits one. That term means that when I produce my digital content, it should be consumed by all learners, regardless of their status, whether hearing impaired, whether visually impaired, whether physically impaired, whether autistic, whether normal, they should be able to consume my content. And we have done this before. We did this in 2019. We tested in KICD. It worked for us. And it is, we were the first one globally to do this, Victoria. So KICD has really ventured in this area of development of content. And we used a platform we were calling the UDL, Universal Design for Learning. That is, which is able to ensure that all our learners are able to consume our content. Then something else I want to add on before I give Juliana an opportunity is that when we are developing content right now, we are making use of animations, we are making use of videos, we are making use of illustrations, photographs, and audio, sounds in our content to make it interactive, because we believe our learners are different. Some are auditory learners, others are visual learners, and others are kinesthetic. So we want to cater for all the categories using the multimedia elements I've just listed, but we want to take it a notch higher. We want to bring the issue of mixed reality. When I'm developing content for physics, for example, I make my learner interact with it real time using mixed reality. I also want to bring in the aspect of virtual reality, where my learners can go for a virtual tour to Seychelles, for example. They tour Seychelles and they come back to class virtually. We are also thinking of enhancing our content and making it have aspects of augmented reality. And I believe this is possible because I told you that one thing I believe is that all things are possible. Anything can be done. And let me stop there so that I don't go too far. Thank you, Victoria.
Thank you, Joseph, and great points coming out there. Let me head over to some of the feedback coming in. Manoj saying traditional face-to-face learning is real-time or synchronous learning, while e-learning can be both synchronous and asynchronous. And that more of a comment than a question. George saying, since there is a very poor correlation between academic success and success in life, well, this shows that an innovative approach towards handling life's challenges is the key to life and growth. Thank you for that, George. Another one here. Good afternoon. You don't give your name, but indeed, any assessment should enable the learner to be creative in the approach towards finding solutions to problems. Yeah, that's right. We're teaching, very critical thinking, not robots. We want to also ensure that they can think for themselves and challenge ideas as well. I wanted to come back to you, Juliana, just in terms of implementation of UNICEF's Reimagine Education program. It's quite ambitious. You're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars that's going to go into this. And I know it has earmarked several countries to start rolling out at least the pilot phase of this. How does it seek to do this? And also in terms of collaboration with various actors in the respective countries that it will be doing the rollout, how does it intend to carry all this out?
Sure, I'll give you a couple of examples. In Rwanda, we're focusing at the moment on getting GIGA started, getting the schools connected to internet, together with the Ministry of ICT and other players in the country. I know that Kenya is participating in GIGA as well, and Safaricom there is working on getting schools connected. In other countries, like in Kazakhstan, my colleagues from GIGA have been able to help the government reduce the monthly cost that they're paying for internet connectivity, which is, of course, one of the main challenges, figuring out, even if you got every school connected, how do you actually pay for that on a monthly basis? So we're also talking with some colleagues in the private sector to see if there are any innovative financing mechanisms that can be used, where investors would invest and the return on that investment could be used to pay for connectivity on a recurring basis. But that's in the works. We'll have to see how it works. One other example of collaboration that you were asking about is a global partnership that UNICEF has with Microsoft. It's a platform called the Learning Passport, which is a platform Microsoft has created onto which countries that don't have their own platforms can load their digital content or their content digitally so that children can access that if it's not already been done. So those are just a couple of examples of the collaboration and the partnerships.
Fantastic, and we're excited to see, what it yields once it's in the pipeline. But just as we begin to wrap up this discussion and to kind of pull out various critical points that were drawn out during this discussion, Joseph, what are some take-homes, for lack of a better term, for anyone who's been watching for the past hour, can say, this is what I want you to walk away with? What would you give them in a bite size? I'll give you about a minute.
Thank you so much, Victoria, for the opportunity. One thing I want to encourage everyone who is watching is that let us embrace change. Let us embrace change. And in this case, in education, let us embrace blended learning. Let us start preparing as parents, as learners, as teachers, as the general population, and prepare for blended learning because it is coming. Thank you.
Thanks. Juliana, over to you.
Well, great minds think alike. UNICEF actually did a study across West, Central, Eastern, and Southern Africa about a year ago regarding lots of different digital applications in the education sphere. And the general conclusion of that study was that there are great opportunities with digital. We have to embrace it, but it's not the be all and end all. It's not a silver bullet. It has to be combined with in-person instruction so that children get the support from a teacher, they can ask questions, and they can have the social interaction with their peers, which is why it's so important that children, despite the COVID epidemic, be able to actually go to school.
Certainly couldn't have said it better myself. I don't know if we have any more comments coming through, but I'm seeing for those of you who are joining us on LinkedIn, someone from France, bonjour, England, Turkey, from all over the world. Thank you so much for joining into the discussion. If they have any more questions or comments, please have them come through via Facebook and of course on the LinkedIn page as well. I want to say thank you so much to my distinguished panel, Juliana, Lindsay, and Joseph Wambua for your great insights, having us think very differently when it comes to the way forward. What's next for education on the continent and the role that digitalization plays in accelerating that. It was a tough lesson to learn thanks to COVID, but a lesson to learn nonetheless. Thank you so much. And of course, keep your eyeballs right here on the LinkedIn page, the Canon EMEA, for more discussions we'll be having under the Africa Frontiers of Innovation Thought Leadership platform. We want to hear from you and make this a community as we go along with these very crucial and important discussions and conversations that arise during this time. COVID was the emergency crisis we didn't see coming, but we have learned the hard way to adjust, to adapt. I heard someone once say that this period is about survival of the quickest, not necessarily the fittest. All right, food for thought. Thank you so much for joining the discussion. And once again, we will be back next month with another engaging discussion, different topic, and of course, another wonderful panel of individuals and experts to help break it down and get us to think differently about the world around us. Thank you for joining us. I'm Victoria Rubadiri. Enjoy the rest of your morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on where you're joining us from. Kwaheri.